As part of our training, we were taught that if a female patient described a memory of incest, we were to regard this as anything but a true memory. It could be a deliberate lie, it could be a self-deception, it could mask a wish for incest, it could be a delusion, it could be a false memory, it could, in its various forms, be a mere fantasy. The one thing it could not be, however, was a genuine memory. That's a quote from The Assault on Truth, a book by former psychoanalyst Jeffrey Masson. In it, Masson argues that Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, deliberately abandoned his original theory for the basis of mental illness, which was essentially that severe mental illness, or what they called hysteria, was caused by real, actual childhood sexual abuse. Instead, Freud replaced that idea with what we now know as the Oedipus complex, claiming that these memories of abuse were not true, but in fact were fantasies and unconscious desires for incest. According to Masson, Freud did this because facing the truth and the reality of this abuse would have meant exposing the horrifying extent of childhood sexual abuse in respectable families, many of whom were Freud's wealthy patients. And unfortunately, this cover-up didn't just protect the abusers, it shaped the entire foundation of psychoanalysis. Now, before we go any further, I want to make something clear. When you hear people discuss this book, if you've heard of it, what you often hear is that Freud dropped this theory to protect his rich clients, or to sort of ensure and to uphold the German social order for respectable higher elites or whatever. But it is complicated because Freud did in fact suppress this theory, and it absolutely did have the effect of gaslighting victims and covering up real sexual abuse. And it did let abusers off the hook. But we don't actually have concrete evidence as to why he changed his view, because there were multiple potential reasons. Maybe it was fear of scandal, maybe it was pressure from his wealthy patients, maybe it was his ambition, his ego, maybe it was all these things combined. The truth is, as the book describes, we don't really have a single piece of concrete evidence. There's no smoking gun. What we do have is a story. We have a story about an ambitious young doctor, desperate to make a name in the medical world, a man whose radical theories were laughed at by his peers, a man whose experimental surgery and hubris led to the disfigurement of his first patient, and a man whose pride would not let him admit his mistakes. But in order to understand all this, we need to first understand a little bit about the author. So Jeffrey Masson was a trained Freudian psychoanalyst, and in the 1970s, Masson was actually chosen by Anna Freud, Sigmund's daughter, to be the project director of the Freud archives. His job was basically to compile and to annotate Freud's correspondence, specifically the letters between Freud and his close friend Wilhelm Fliess. Now, Freud's daughter had previously published an abridged version of these letters back in the 50s, but it being an abridged version, there's a lot of letters missing. So Masson's job was to create a complete unabridged edition. And that's where he started noticing weird patterns in what had been initially left out of the abridged version. As Masson wrote, "As I was reading through the correspondence and preparing the annotations for the first volume of the series, the Freud-Fliess letters, I began to notice what appeared to be a pattern in the omissions made by Anna Freud. In the original abridged edition, in the letters written after September 1897, when Freud was supposed to have given up his seduction theory, all the case histories dealing with sexual seduction of children were excised. Moreover, every mention of Emma Eckstein, an early patient of Freud and Fliess, who seemed connected in some way with the seduction theory, was deleted." So when Masson asked Anna Freud about these removals, she didn't want him to publish findings about Freud's early seduction theory letters, thinking this would be confusing to people, but Masson thought differently, because while he was reading about it, he believed those missing letters might show that Freud's rejection of the idea that hysteria and severe mental illness could be caused by real childhood sexual abuse, that wasn't based on some new scientific discovery, right? He didn't abandon it based on new evidence, but he was beginning to find that maybe this was abandoned due to some dark reasons, something that was being kept out of the correspondence and intentionally covered up. And we'll come back to that. But to understand that better, we need to kind of explain how radical Freud's initial ideas were and why his abandonment of these ideas was so significant. And to do that, we need to understand what mental health treatment looked like in the 1890s. First off, the field of psychology, as we know it, basically didn't exist yet. If you had what we call mental health issues, you'd be dealing with medical doctors who had a very limited understanding of psychological causality. The prevailing theories were mostly physical. Mental illness was thought to be caused by problems with your brain, your nervous system, or your character. Women in particular were often diagnosed with what's called hysteria, which was basically a catch-all term for any kind of emotional, psychological symptoms that doctors just couldn't explain, which it's kind of funny too, because the word comes from the Greek word for uterus. But in all seriousness, it's because doctors back then believed that women's reproductive organs were the source of their mental problems. And to be fair, it's not the most absurd leap in the world. Everyone knows how a woman's mood can change throughout her menstrual or reproductive cycle. So it's not that much of a leap to presume that, stuff going wrong with all the lady parts down there, it's not a bad assumption to think that that could be the source of greater mood disorders. Unfortunately, though, this led to really weird and horrific treatments, which sometimes involved hysterectomies or castrations. I don't know if that's the right word, but I'm going to use it anyways. This was all in an attempt to cure hysteria. But then here comes Freud with an idea that these symptoms were being caused by trauma that happened to them in their childhood that the body is holding on to. This was a pretty groundbreaking idea. And you've got to remember, this was still the Victorian era, right? So childhood sexual abuse is just not something people talked about, like at all. And if a child said they've been abused, people didn't care and they didn't believe them. So when Freud came along and said, hey, maybe these women aren't necessarily crazy, maybe something horrible happened to them, it was a pretty big deal. Very few people were really talking about that. So how did Freud come to these ideas? Well, in 1895 and 1896, Freud began treating patients who'd been dismissed by other doctors as liars, whose memories of abuse were just fantasies. Right? This was the sort of genesis of the seduction theory. Now, as I said earlier, it really cannot be overstated. No one was talking about this. This was a really groundbreaking thing, right? It might sound obvious to us now, especially with books like The Body Keeps the Score, or I can't think of another one. But back then, this was an unheard of idea. And in April 1896, Freud decided to go public with this idea. He delivered a lecture to the Society of Psychiatry and Neurology in Vienna titled The Etiology of Hysteria. And this was the first time he ever delivered his ideas publicly. But unfortunately for Freud, the response to his lectures was really harsh. And it gives us some insight into why he might have changed his mind about the seduction theory. Freud was met with what he described as an, quote, icy reception. No one asked questions, no one engaged with his ideas, no one showed any interest in his theory whatsoever. His theory was referred to as a, quote, scientific fairy tale. And for someone as ambitious and ego-driven as Freud, this was clearly bothering him. And in his letter that he wrote to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, Freud referred to his colleagues in the room as a bunch of, quote, asses who can, quote, all go to hell. It clearly bothered him. This is probably a good time to talk about who Freud was as a person, because understanding his character will kind of help get a fuller picture of why he abandoned the seduction theory. Freud generally wasn't that objective. He tended towards tunnel vision, and when he would get a patient, they would always happen to be afflicted by whatever illness he was currently thinking about. But apart from this, he was also very ambitious, which isn't bad. But in his youth, he was pretty obsessed with fame and money, and he was also very sensitive to criticism. If you want to see something kind of funny, you should read some of his letters to his then fiance, but to his wife, Marta Bernays, because you just see like his insecurity coming out constantly. And it is a little funny, and he's also kind of a dick to her a little bit. Within the letters, there's times where He's talking about how he's sacrificing to marry her, how he could marry someone of greater esteem, or he said that her sister is the prettier one. He also blamed her for getting in the way of his scientific discoveries about cocaine. Also, he was on coke a lot of the time of their engagement, so I don't want to be too harsh about his letters. And also, to be fair to Freud, this doesn't really invalidate anything. In fact, I think it kind of humanizes him a bit, because I can see how him being Jewish in the 19th century Vienna, he would rightly have a chip on his shoulder, and he might feel the need to prove himself, right? Like, that makes perfect sense to me, that I get that. But despite this, or even because of this, it then makes sense why throughout Freud's career, he had this pattern of developing theories, promoting them, and then abandoning them when they didn't bring him the recognition that he expected. Like, he was constantly starting and stopping and dropping projects before reaching any significant results. I think this rightly leads us to believe that Freud seemed to be more interested in being the innovator, the forerunner, rather than the scientist. Which isn't, that's not trying to be a dig, right? I get it. All of this, to this point, I feel is really relatable. But it feels very different, though, when it comes to the seduction theory. Because as discussed in Masson's book, Freud was well aware of the reality of childhood sexual abuse, because he studied this when he was in Paris. There's no way that Freud abandoned this theory because he thought abuse was rare, because Freud would have had extensive exposure to evidence of the contrary. But he chose to ignore it in favor of a theory that claimed that his patients were not abused as children, but in fact were internalizing a deep desire to sleep with their fathers. So, what evidence? What are we talking about? Well, in 1885, while completing his medical studies, Freud traveled to Paris to study under Jean-Martin Charcot. Whatever, I don't care about pronouncing it right. He was a renowned neurologist who specialized in hysteria. More importantly, though, for our story, Paris in the 1880s was where the preeminent research on child abuse was taking place. French researchers had been documenting childhood sexual abuse since the 1850s, and this wasn't like all theoretical stuff. These researchers were the ones performing autopsy on the children who had been abused, and they were documenting the physical evidence of their trauma. And Freud had access to all this research, right? Not only did he have books of many of these researchers, while he was in Paris, he also attended lectures of Freud, who was one of these main researchers on child abuse, whose lectures were done at the morgue, which included autopsies. Masson notes in his book in 1885, just before Freud arrived in Paris, Freud was often drawing the attention of his audience at the autopsies to the abuse of children by their parents and teachers. So, Freud wasn't just reading about child abuse in books. In Paris, he trained under some of the leading experts on childhood sexual abuse, and he would have seen the physical signs of that abuse firsthand, right? This makes his later abandonment of the seduction theory worse, right? It's not like a thing that he dropped because he didn't follow through and didn't have evidence for it. He was well aware that childhood sexual abuse did exist, but in fact, he still dropped it. As Masson says in his book, Paris provided Freud with experiences and evidence on which he built his thesis in 1896, that real sexual traumas in childhood lay at the very heart of neurotic illness. Still, in fairness to Freud, however, these same men, Charcot, Freud, also argued that victims often lied. However, it wasn't an outright rejection that this stuff didn't take place. That's not what it was. It was a class thing. So you kind of see the attitude of the time there, right? When poor men were accused, they were clearly guilty because they were degenerates. But when rich men were accused, well, the child was lying, right? It very quickly became a class thing. Hysterical women were said to be liars who imagined all sorts of perversities, but usually if their dad was loaded, right? And as the book says, quote, when Freud left Paris, no doubt both of the currents he had been exposed to were active in his thinking. One tradition said that sexual assaults on children were frequent and that children seldom imagined it. The other said that rape was rare, but children often imagined it. Put simply, sexual abuse did happen, but respectable society told itself it was mostly a lower class, poor people thing. And this double standard planted the seeds for what would come next, which unfortunately brings us to the tragic story of Emma Eckstein, the woman whom Freud and his friend Fliess would inadvertently disfigure her. But first, to understand what happened next in Freud's story, we do need to understand his relationship with Wilhelm Fliess. Fliess was an ear, nose, and throat surgeon from Berlin who, even for back then, he had weird ideas. He believed that there was an intrinsic connection between the nose and the sexual organs, and he believed that problems with the nose could cause sexual dysfunction, and vice versa. Now, to be clear, these ideas, even for back then, were ridiculous. Like, according to however they would measure stuff back then still, no one thought this, right? There was no scientific basis to believe that performing a surgery on your nose would keep you from masturbating. But Fliess was pretty confident in his ideas, and Freud was impressed and enamored by Fliess. He was like his best friend. And both of them shared a belief that sexuality played a central role in mental illness, though they both had different ideas of how that manifested, but still there was a overlap. And they both worked together primarily on Emma Eckstein's case, which brings us back to Emma. So Emma Eckstein was a young woman from a prominent Jewish socialist family, and she came to Freud seeking help for just a variety of health issues like stomach problems, menstrual problems, trouble with walking, and according to Fliess's weird nose thing, the way to cure it was by doing surgery on her nose. The idea was that her stomach issues and menstrual problems were the result of excessive masturbating. So if they did surgery on the nose, that would curtail the excessive masturbating, which would then diminish her other health problems. Now, again, there was no mainstream medical support. This was literally just Fliess's weird personal theories. The surgery was performed in February 1895, with Fliess removing a portion of bone from Emma's nose, and it was a complete disaster. Almost immediately after the surgery, Emma began experiencing severe complications. She was in constant pain, she couldn't stop bleeding, and she developed a serious infection. For 2 weeks, she just got progressively worse and worse, almost to the point of dying. And Freud began to seriously panic. So Freud was so desperate that he had to call in another surgeon named Robert Gersony to examine Emma. And sorry, I shouldn't laugh at it, but it's horrific. It's horrible, right? Gersony found that the result of her infection and the fact that Emma was basically dying was because Fliess had left like half a meter of gauze inside Emma's nasal cavity. I'll put a picture up of half a meter for Americans. The gauze had become infected and Emma almost died because of the complications. And we kind of have this presentist bias where we look at old-fashioned medical stuff and we're like, well, that seems like a easy mistake for them to make 100 years ago. But even for back then, right, this wasn't like a small surgical error. This was like gross negligence on the part of Fliess, right? Fliess performed an unnecessary surgery that was predicated on his own personal, weird, unproven theories. And this resulted in him leaving, like 1.5 feet of gauze in her nasal cavity. Even for back then, this should have resulted in some sort of consequence, right? But instead of holding Fliess accountable for this massive mistake, instead Freud thought of a way to cover it up. So throughout Emma's medical crisis, Freud was writing regular letters to Fliess, updating him on her condition. And you just kind of see this immense desire throughout these letters of trying to make sure that Fliess knows that Freud does not blame him, that it's not Fliess's fault, even though it is Fliess's fault. And he's bending over backwards to make sure that Fliess doesn't receive any blame for this. Initially, Freud describes the complications as normal surgical risks, and he insists that Fliess did nothing wrong, that this kind of thing happens sometimes. But as Emma's condition worsened, and especially after they found the half a meter of gauze, this sort of delusion was harder to maintain. But Freud found a way to protect his friend. He just blamed Emma. And this is what Masson kind of argues is the foundation of psychoanalysis. In a letter to Fliess, Freud wrote, "I shall be able to prove to you that you were right, that her episodes of bleeding were hysterical, were occasioned by longing, and probably occurred at the sexually relevant times." End quote. Gross. What Freud is saying here is that Emma's bleeding, the massive hemorrhaging that basically killed her, the one that was in fact caused by the pus and infected gauze left in her face. He was saying it was her weird psychological woman stuff, right? He was claiming that it was her psychological desire to bleed, which came out of her unconscious desires and fantasies. So Masson basically argues that this is the source of the origins of psychoanalysis. This is where the concrete shift and where the official dropping of the seduction hypothesis took place. No longer was it physical trauma that caused hysteria. Instead, it was your internal desires that manifested your physical health issues. Freud elaborates on this theory in subsequent letters, claiming that Emma, quote, bled out of longing, that she had, quote, always been a bleeder in emotionally charged situations, basically claiming that her nearly dying was just her seeking attention. As Freud wrote, quote, "When she saw how affected I was by her first hemorrhage, while she was in the hands of Rosens, she experienced this as the realization of an old wish to be loved in her illness, and in spite of the danger during the succeeding hours, she felt happy as never before." Instead of acknowledging that his friend's incompetence, because Fliess had never, I should have said this earlier, up until this point, Fliess had never actually done a major surgery before. So instead of just admitting that his friend's incompetence nearly killed a patient, Freud shifted the theory in order to cover for this ridiculous mistake. So let's talk about the new theory. All right, so because what Freud's doing with Emma, reinterpreting the physical symptoms as psychological fantasy, this is the ground of what he would do with his patients in the future, right? Whenever Freud encountered evidence that contradicted his theories, he would reinterpret that evidence as a psychological fantasy. So patients who reported sexual abuse weren't describing real events, they were expressing unconscious desires. Women who experienced physical symptoms weren't suffering from medical problems, they were manifesting psychological conflicts. When you hear people talk about this book, this is where a lot of this comes from. Many of his patients were women from wealthy, prominent families. Exactly the kind of families where, as we talked about earlier, sexual abuse would be impossible to come from them because they're rich. Freud was left with a choice: believe his patients and potentially shake up the whole world, or reframe their trauma as lies and fantasy and preserve his social standing. And as Masson argues in his book, that's what he does. Before we wrap up, let's come back to the idea of the motivation. Why did he abandon the seduction theory? Was it a genuine, true scientific innovation? Was he moving on because of new evidence? Or was it motivated by other reasons? If you hear people talk online, you're just going to hear that Freud abandoned this to protect his rich clients or whatever. But as Masson argues, there is multiple reasons that likely contributed to Freud dropping the seduction theory. There is definitely social pressure, right? his colleagues made it clear that pursuing this idea would damage his reputation. There's definitely an economic pressure because many of his patients came from wealthy families who might not like the idea of this being brought to the light, presuming it's true. But then there's also the case of Emma Eckstein, which gave us a more personal reason why Freud would want to distance himself from this idea and develop an idea that might protect him and Fleece. By reframing Emma's surgical complication as psychological fantasies, not only did it provide cover for Freud and Fleece for their medical malpractice, but it gave him a template for encountering uncomfortable truths from here on out. So, did Freud invent psychoanalysis to hide sexual abuse? Well, the answer is it's complicated. It's not very concrete. But what we do know is that Freud was well aware of the reality of childhood abuse. Even if all of his patients were lying, he was aware of the reality of abuse, and he was aware that it did happen, so it was wrong to claim that they were mostly fantasies. He knew that. And even if he didn't, dropping the theory had the unfortunate effect of silencing victims for the next century. So, with that, I really do appreciate you for taking the time to listen to this, but don't just take my word for it. You should read the book. It's pretty good. So, with that, thanks for watching. God bless.